The teachings of Christ, I can't find any faults in it.
And I think that's the story for lots of people. They get to a place where they really want Christianity to be true. They encounter Jesus in some way or have a supernatural experience, or there's something that then just tips them over the line.
Wait, so are you proper Christian now?
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that I'm asking God for. I'm asking God for a new story.
And I have, since writing the book, become a Christian.
And the public conversation, whether it was Jordan Peterson or whoever, it is now acceptable to talk about faith in a different way. And you go straight onto social media and start saying, I've become a Christian, or I'm thinking about it, or I'm interested.
I have been saved by the Lord Jesus Christ.
As someone who became a Christian from a non-Christian background, was exploring faith by themselves, became a Christian by themselves, enjoyed reading the Bible by themselves, consuming Christian content by themselves. It was in church I actually learned what it meant to be a Christian, because I got to watch people who were older than me living out their faith.
Where does that journey of believing begin for someone like me?
Footballers, historians, podcasters, feminists, what do they all have in common? They are all, not all of them, but many of them, exploring faith. And we are living in this time of spiritual curiosity. Welcome to the Being Human podcast. If you're coming back to us, having listened before, if you're new, you're so welcome. Love you joining us today. And we love to think about what it means to be human and how we live in light of the ultimate human being, Jesus Christ. On this season, we're going to be exploring spiritual curiosity, the rise of it. What is it? What can we do about it? And I am joined by a new co-host, a new co-lead of Being Human, our resident expert on all things spiritually curious.
Wow, there we go. What a title, the expert on all things spiritually curious. I don't think that is true, but I'm definitely interested in spiritual curiosity in the times that we're living in.
And how long have you been with the Being Human Project?
So I have been with the Being Human Project for 2.5 years now.
Wow.
Time
how long
has
have you been
flown.
the co-lead as of today?
Today.
No,
Yeah.
it's brilliant to have Katherine joining us on the podcast. You and I are going to be hosting this series together. Me as the old timer and you as our new expert. It's fantastic. And we are looking at spiritual curiosity and what that means. And I guess sometimes when I'm out speaking, I throw out some names and some people are like, oh yeah, I totally get that. I know who that is. And sometimes you're like, who are you talking about? And I'm like, somebody Katherine told me about.
Oh, that's funny. I think we're living in really interesting times, because if you speak about all of the people who in the public sphere are exploring faith at the moment, there will be some names that some types of people will know, and there'll be some names that they won't know, but another type of person will know, because it's so widespread, the spiritual curiosity. It's not just like historians and feminists, but like you said, it's footballers as well, and it's celebrities and singers. So we're just seeing it across the board, which is really exciting. Well, why don't we talk about a few of these people? So kick us off with Jordan Peterson, because I feel like a few years ago, the Peterson effect was maybe what begun this sort of online exploration of faith.
I think he is the daddy of this whole thing, like of the spiritual curiosity. He was very public about it. He became a huge deal. And so particularly for slightly older people like me, he was a person that a lot of people were reading. He obviously topped the kind of bestseller lists and top books lists on Amazon. And it was a kind of quite a long journey. There was a political element to it. There was stuff around the kind of trans and C16 debate. It was called in Canada free speech. That brought him to the fore. And then he dabbled really heavily in theology. And he used to do these 3-hour lectures on Genesis in downtown Toronto, when people paid to come and listen to him.
Yeah.
And an hour of it was really interesting theology, and an hour of it was relatively interesting psychology, and an hour of it was just totally wacko stuff in between.
And the effects on a generation listening to him were huge. And I remember a few years ago, so it's probably right before I started this role, I went to a lecture and it was a guy called Paul Vanderklay who does reaction videos to the Jordan Peterson stuff. And the host of this lecture, at one point, after all this, interesting theological discussion about, rising spiritual openness and whatever, just turned to us as the audience and said, put your hand up if you have become a Christian recently through listening to Jordan Peterson or watching a Paul Vanderklay reaction to a Jordan Peterson video. And so many people put their hands up. So then in the break, I'm just trying to talk to as many of these people as possible. I'm like, so how did it happen? Because it felt like 3 years ago, that was the first time I'd heard stories like that of these. They were basically all young men who had watched these, YouTube videos and then had gone on a faith journey in their bedrooms. And I hadn't really heard stories like that before. And there were so many of them just in the room there. It was fascinating. But we're seeing that now more and more and more.
So it's definitely shifting the dial. So Peterson's up one end. Let me go to the other end, the one I know less about and you maybe do. Theo Von.
Yeah, so
Who's he?
Theo Von, comedian, like really funny guy, has got an interesting journey with faith, raised in the American South, is probably a cultural Christian, talks a lot about addiction and his struggles with addiction. And then more recently on his podcast, has been really open about how he started praying and reading the Bible and actually looking into Christianity. And then those are the conversations he's wanting to have. So where a few years ago, you would have never seen him talking about content like that. Now it's just, yeah, of course, this is part of his journey and this is what he wants to talk about.
And it's worth stating, obviously, the podcast video space is a massive part of this. Like, so Joe Rogan is the biggest podcast in the world. We haven't even fully mentioned him yet, but like that in terms of scale of influence, 5-10 million kind of listeners and some of these YouTube videos. So that's one of the reasons where some people won't have heard of these people at all because they're not on a kind of mainstream media platform. They get talked about afterwards. And lots of people are sitting in these channels so another channel, for example, is a lot of the guys around supplements, around kind of fitness. So I come across Andrew Huberman. He's one of these guys in that space who would think he would articulate that he is a Christian. Really into his kind of fitness and faith. Somebody like Bryan Johnson is one you've picked up on, not saying he's a Christian, but interested in faith.
Yeah, so Bryan Johnson is this guy who is wanting to live forever. And he has gone viral at different moments over the past few years for doing really strange things. One of his famous moments was, I think he injected his son's blood into himself. Like he did some really strange things. But his newest thing that he tweeted about, shared about online, is that he's trying praying. That's his new thing to see if it makes you live longer. He has noticed real psychological benefits to praying. Now, who he's praying to, I don't know. I think he's an ex-Mormon, so he's got some faith background, but he's saying, you know what, as part of this journey of wanting to live forever, prayer is part of it. And of course, as an evangelist, I would love to continue. Like, I'd love to jump into that conversation and say, really, you want to live forever? I'll tell you a way you can live forever.
It's cheaper than some of his other options.
Yes.
I think he spends £1 million a year kind of thing or something on some of these regimes that he has.
Yeah, exactly. All he needs to do is give his life to Jesus. There you go. It's the only
so
way.
Andrew Huberman was having a conversation, I think, with Chris Williamson, another one of these guys with a huge podcast. I don't think Williamson would say he's a person of faith, but again, is interviewing lots of people around faith. I mean, he had Louise Perry on his podcast.
Yeah, and he had the Girl Gone Bible, the two girls that run Girl Gone Bible, where they're basically just American Christians who unpack the Bible and talk to young girls about what it's like to be a Christian and encouraging them in their faith. And he got them on to talk about the rise in spiritual curiosity on his podcast. I thought, that's so interesting that you've invited in these two, like all they do is Christian content and you've got them on your podcast. Like a few years ago, we would have never seen that. So it's amazing. And then, of course, we've got to talk about Stephen Bartlett.
Yes.
The Diary of a CEO. So he's been on.
Why do we have to talk about him? Just for, again, people who maybe aren't always going, what, who?
So the Diary of a CEO, particularly, I would say for young men in their 20s and 30s, is a hugely popular podcast. I mean, he gets millions of views on every single episode. Like he's just super, super popular in that, very specific sort of sphere. Although I think lots of girls listen to him as well. When I speak to friends, like they definitely listen to him.
He does have a crossover because he is Dragon's Den, or has been on Dragon's Den, so he is on mainstream kind of TV, which is where people might see him from.
He also talks about AI and all different types of things and issues and politics and all of that. But what's interesting is one of his friends has become a Christian, has been baptized. His friend was the classic searching for life, for money, for success, moved out to Dubai, was really successful out there, but felt empty, started exploring faith, became a Christian, got baptized. And Stephen has seen this whole journey in his friend, and it, I think, has made him interested in the Christian faith. So he's hosted roundtable discussions and had various different Christian thinkers on his podcast.
Like?
So he's had Wes Huff, which is
the Wes Huff. And Wes Huff, again, for people who don't know, became pretty famous off the back of being on Joe Rogan's show. So that's the biggest podcast in the world, as we say. And then he goes on to Stephen Bartlett. And while I thought Rogan's was interesting, it's like 3 hours. And he gets there in it's like a 48-hour window. There's a whole series of events that are kind of crazy. This guy comes from almost nowhere. A lovely Canadian apologist suddenly finds himself in Joe Rogan. And then Stephen Bartlett jokes that he spent months chasing him to try and get him on a show. And Wes was so busy and just kind of dealing with how suddenly his profile had shifted, he kept declining. And he goes on and it's like 5 million plus views, like a huge apologetic moment.
Amazing.
And I think the one on Steve Bartlett, the Diary of a CEO, is arguably a much better and wider conversation. He has a really lovely way of engaging. So he's very strong on the details, Weshoff, but he has this lovely way of engaging. And he's a fitness guy, which I think is an extra resonance with these guys. He just works in that space with them.
Yeah. And I think where Joe Rogan is like really interested in ancient texts. And so it's all about the historicity of the Bible and all of that, which for a certain type of listener, like they're going to find that very interesting. Stephen Bartlett just goes for the classic apologetics questions. He's like, well, what about suffering? What's going to happen after I die? Am I going to hell? Yeah, he asked
Kind of led with that almost on his social media, didn't he?
Yeah, great clickbait moment. But Wes Huff answered super well. And at the time of recording this, we're still waiting for this to come out. But John Lennox is also going to be interviewed by Stephen Bartlett, which is, I'm sure, will be an incredible evangelistic moment.
I know, we got a sneaky photo from Joe. He used to be here telling us that had just happened. So by the time you listen, it'll be well out there. Now, I said Chris Williamson interviewed Louise Perry. That's another interesting name that you and I are familiar with. Again, people might not be. Why is she an interesting character in this conversation?
Well, Louise Perry is fascinating because she approached Christianity first and exploring Christianity because she could see that Christianity worked as a set of moral values, as a sort of way to live. She's like, this is the best way for women to thrive, for marriages to thrive. And she wrote a book, what's it called again? The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Yep. And in that, she wasn't a Christian at the time, but would say, I can see how Christianity works. And actually, I think the best way for families to thrive is in, if there are monogamous marriages, and there we go, children are born into married relationships. But since she has written that book, there have been lots of different Christians involved in her journey, sharing faith with her. She now says that she is a Christian. She said, because it works sociologically, then maybe it could be supernaturally.
And her feminism essentially got her there. Initially, she said that's what drove her. She realized her feminism was informed by Christianity, whether she liked it or not. And then she said, well, actually, maybe I do like it. Then she became intellectually and kind of convinced and joined a church community, and now is much more overt about her faith journey around that.
And I think that's the story for lots of people. They get to a place where they really want Christianity to be true. So they're looking at it, they're like, it's so lovely. Like, I would love for that to be true. And then they discover, it really is true. So they encounter Jesus in some way or have a supernatural experience, or there's something that then just tips them over the line. But I think that's very common.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who came from a Muslim background, became an atheist, went on tour with Richard Dawkins and others. And then she, again, intellectually, essentially assented to faith and then has joined the faith community along with her husband, Sir Neil Ferguson, the historian. And a bit like Tom Holland, who seemed to go from, atheist to agnostic. And then more recently has been more overt in saying, well, essentially, in his book Dominion, the Christian story is so persuasive to how we got to equality and dignity and human rights that I've moved from no longer an atheist to an agnostic. And then I think is more articulately saying, I am a Christian. I have begun to believe this story that I have been exploring.
Yeah, totally. And just going back to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, what's interesting about her story is obviously it was an intellectual journey and she's an incredibly intelligent woman. But when she was talking to, I think it was Dawkins she was talking to about her journey, she says, I can't describe it in any other way, but I had a hole in my life that nothing could fill. It was a spiritual hole. And, God's filled that. And so there's a real emotional and experiential journey for her as well, where she's experienced something in becoming a Christian that has utterly convinced her. She's like, I can't really describe it totally intellectually. She's intellectually convinced as well. It's not that she's just gone, well, we don't need to think about it. She's left her brain at the door. No, she's thought it through. But there's there's been something also emotionally and in her experience of life that has happened that's convinced her of Christianity, which I find that very exciting.
No, these are just like almost a little sprinkling of the people. There are lots more, both famous people and less famous people. If we were into football, we might mention more footballers, Eze and others, and there's a big movement of footballers and more cultural figures. So we're going to come back to some of these characters. We've just given a kind of sprinkling to start us off. My generation, if it's not a surprise to everybody that I'm older than you, Richard Dawkins would have been well-known character who we mentioned. He would not even describe himself as a cultural Christian, acknowledging the waters that we're swimming in are still so influenced by Christianity. But I guess the kind of better-known atheist of the younger generation is Alex O'Connor.
Yeah.
He's your generation. You talk about him then.
Well, Alex O'Connor is fascinating. And as I chat to different churches and leaders and ask them, what are the questions that people are asking on your Alpha courses, Christianity Explored courses? What are the sort of apologetics questions of today? And it's interesting that there has been, in this time of spiritual curiosity where people are open, and generally there has been a move away from the classic apologetics questions. I'd actually say because of Alex O'Connor, there's been a resurrection of some of those questions. So there's a lot of questions about genocides in the Old Testament. So if anyone listening to this is running an evangelistic course and you get a question about genocide in the Old Testament, it's probably because the person has watched an Alex O'Connor video. And I'd so recommend you watching Alex O'Connor. But even Alex O'Connor, who would sort of be your classic, typical atheist figure for this generation, would describe himself as agnostic. So he's got some connection with the idea of the transcendent and is open to the idea of the spiritual. And let's actually listen to him talk about it.
You now considering yourself an agnostic?
Yeah, I still don't know if God exists. Like that is just true. I don't know.
So there you go. Alex O'Connor, famous atheist of my generation, says, yeah, I'm agnostic. Yeah, I'm open to the idea. I'm not a materialist, which is interesting. I'm sure when you were like in your 20s and 30s, that is not the way the atheists would talk. That's not the way they describe themselves. One of the things that we should definitely talk about in this time of spiritual curiosity is the quiet revival. And this was a research report by the Bible Society, which has then been retracted. And so the question is, are we living in spiritually curious times? Was the quiet revival just made up? What do you have to say?
Oh, lots. But so Quiet Revival, Bible Society produced this big report a couple of years ago now. And why is it so important? Because it surveyed I think it's 11,500 people. And it was built on a previous survey of nearly 17,000 people. So when we read polling about voting intentions and stuff, it's usually 1,000 people, 1,500 people. So this was a massive piece of research. So we were all like, oh, really interesting. It confirmed some other piece of research that we'd already seen out there from Fusion, from Youth for Christ, on Bible sales, all of which were showing a real increase. But we were almost like, really? Like, is this definitely true? And then the Quiet Revival seemed to absolutely nail that. It said church attendance was up 50%. It was like quadrupling amongst young people, sort of from 4% to 16% amongst young men in particular. So it had gone from 8% to 12% across the population. This huge spike in particular with young men. So the church was younger, more male than we thought, and more male overall, and more ethnically diverse. So it's three great findings. And there was a lot of pushback, and everybody kept looking at the findings again and again, saying, no, they're right. And eventually YouGov have come and said, actually, we can't stand over those findings at this stage due to some flaws in their system. Now, there's a couple of things to say about that. One is it's not wrong. It's just that it's not reliable. We've seen 6 or 7 data points that suggest, to me at least, I would say that it's broadly right. That's because of the Bible sales, because of the fusion work amongst students and their interest in the Bible, because of a number of other surveys about spiritual curiosity, and our own surveys in EA about church attendance, how many people are going, and that they are younger and more diverse. We have to hold this kind of bracket of, was revival the right term? Was this a good idea? It's a friend of mine, one of my lecturers, Paul Williams, is essentially the author of the report. And they thought about what they were doing there. I think they were provoking with that. I think there was thought to it. So I'm not against the title. What I've heard one of my colleagues here talk about is we're more in a loud awakening rather than a quiet revival. It's no longer quiet, whatever's going on. And whether it's a revival or not, that's an interesting question, but something's moving. What we also know, so I think there's that, and we put a little bracket around that particular piece of research, but if we're only relying on that, that would be a problem, but we are relying on 6 or 7 pieces of research that are definitely raising questions. Is there a simple pattern? Probably not. You get this really mixed data because church attendance is changing. People don't go to church as often as they used to before the pandemic. People engage online, they listen to content in lots of different places. So it's actually becoming really hard to track what engagement looks like for people. But we've got stats and we've also got stories. I think that's the other really important piece. If this again was just on stats, but we're getting stories from right across the UK. It's undoubted to me that as those data started to come in, people were like almost a bit skeptical. And then as it came, they began to go, oh, actually, no, that is happening. And I would say it was in England first, and then Scotland and Northern Ireland came a little bit later, literally a few months behind. And then Wales, I think we've seen it there too. There's a few other, Asbury Revival, I think is really interesting, or Asbury Awakening, the kind of movement amongst young people. I think there are some links to that. And there are lots of stories. We've seen the press pick it up, and then we've seen real life stories, a lot of dream stories, a lot of people just Googling and turning up at church stories. You've heard them, I've heard them, loads of colleagues have heard them. Again, I was somewhere this morning, dream stories again were coming up, just people Googling and turning up at church stories right across the UK. There's no particular pattern to this. So from my point of view, I think it's huge. I'm really interested in the data, first of all. And yes, it was a big moment when we couldn't hold that report, but it's way bigger than that. And I know you've heard loads of stories around this.
Oh yeah, and I'm a stories person, so I just absolutely love all of the stories of this time. And I think one of the reflections that some places that have maybe found the Quiet Revival hard when it first got released, where they were like, but we're just not seeing this. Like, I feel really disappointed. I feel left out. I feel let down by God, was maybe because they were expecting a revival where it's like you've got hundreds of young people queuing out of your church door on a Sunday. But actually what most churches have seen are just 1, 2, 3 more young people come along that weren't coming before, or not just young people, but people who weren't exploring faith, who are, like we had people locally show up who had just bought a Bible online and then rocked up. We've seen loads of different people just wander into church where they wouldn't have a few years ago. Like when I used to work in student ministry, I'd always be saying to students and student workers, you can't just expect people to show up on a Sunday. Like, you have to go. The Great Commission is therefore go and make disciples. Like, there's a go element. You've got to go and reach them. People aren't just going to wander in on a Sunday. We can't expect that. Or else now we're just seeing people wander in. I still think we need to go and we need to make Jesus known for sure. But there's definitely been a shift of people wandering in.
I mean, some people say to me, is it just young people? No, it's a wider group of people, but there is a move amongst young people, I would say, in everything I'm hearing. Is it just men? No, but there is definitely a spike in interest amongst men that weren't there before. I mean, I think those are the two trends that people talk quite a lot, certainly to me, about, and I'm like, I think they're both true. That doesn't mean what people sometimes hear is then there are no women or there are no older people. It's absolutely not what anybody's saying. So both the stories and the data tell us that there's a growth overall, and people are seeing that. It's also true in church size. We know if it's a smaller church, it's less likely to happen. Again, it doesn't mean it won't. Larger churches are probably seeing more growth at the minute. And it's not surprising that some of that will be in cities because more young people gravitate to cities. I mean, there's some just understanding of sociology and geography that helps us understand some of what's happening.
Yeah, I'm interested, Peter, because I've been a Christian for 10 years. And when I first became a Christian, when I rocked up to church, I think they were quite surprised that I was there. I was like, I have become a Christian. They're like, how? I'm like, I felt like I should explore it. And I've tried praying. I've been through some hard stuff. I've tried praying and I've experienced something that has convinced me that God's real. And I don't think they'd ever encountered a story like that. And I realized for the first few years of being a Christian, there's not that many people who don't have Christians in their family. Like I'm one of the few actually that has a totally atheist family. And there's not that many people around that haven't been raised in church. Interesting. Whereas now it feels like there's tons and tons of people who are totally new to faith, have no exposure to faith, who are just coming into church. But you, over your life, must have seen a real shift. I'm not calling you old. just wisdom and experience, Peter. You must have seen this shift happen in a way that I can't have seen in 10 years, because I think all of my generation, like all of my friends have always been open. I've always been like excited to share my faith, and they've seemed to always have been like mostly receptive. Or else, have you seen a change?
Definitely. So, I mean, I've been a Christian more than 40 years, and I have to say then, which is wonderful, but you just realize that that's a long time. And I guess I was raised in a Christian home and in a part of the world in Northern Ireland where there was a much higher percentage of people who were Christians. So I think initially it was probably a bit more defensive. It was less common to see people become Christians, and it was almost, how do we keep you guys Christians? Because it was such a family thing. And then I saw the move as I went to uni, and as probably the world did begin to shift around a bit, it became a much more contested thing. Like, it was a big deal to say you were a Christian, and there was pushback around that. And we moved from that more traditional apologetic that actually we were talking about earlier. Did Jesus live? Did he die? Did he rise from the dead? That was a big thing. And I would have given those talks as a young person, as a young lawyer. And then people were like less interested in that question. They just weren't interested in God at all. And the culture said, no, we can dismiss God. There's no time for God. We've moved on from that. And the biggest shift is the kind of water we're swimming in, this acknowledgement, even from a Richard Dawkins, a cultural Christian, whatever that means. And you can dig into that. But the notion that life is still framed, but fundamentally by a Christian understanding, from the dates that we use, from everything within Parliament, from our understanding more fundamentally of what it is to be human, equal, dignity, rights. Like, that has shifted. And the public conversation, whether it was Jordan Peterson or whoever, the beginning of that, it is now acceptable to talk about faith in a different way. No, it's more complex. I think that's one of the challenges. Everybody's doing this in real time. Like, so people are just talking about the faith, and you go straight onto social media and start saying, I've become a Christian, or I'm thinking about it, or I'm interested. And in the mix of that, there's something absolutely wonderful. And the mix of that is also something like a bit, whoa, that's really good. The first thing you said, and the second bit's just like flat out wrong, like probably heresy. So how do we navigate? I think that's part of the challenge that comes. That there's incredible openness. We're both saying it, and we as an organization, all our colleagues talk about this. That isn't without some challenges, which I think we can navigate, but I think we've got to recognize. So the first of those is, it's spiritual curiosity across the board. I mean, that's the first thing we're going to say. This is not just Christianity. It's by far and away the biggest, I would say, because of where we are and the culture that we're in. But people are interested in all forms of spirituality.
Yes. And so you're seeing people explore every religion, mix religions together, say, I'm interested in Hinduism and Buddhism. I've bought a deck of tarot cards, and also I might give church a go, and sort of being like, this is fine to hold all of these things together. We're definitely seeing a rise in people's exploration of sort of alternative spirituality. So some of the things that would have fallen under the banner of like New Age spirituality, and Islam as well, is seeing a rise in interest and intrigue and exploration. So yeah.
So I think there's a pick and mix kind of risk, isn't it? Because we've got the consumerist mindset, like all of us have it, like no matter what. So we all do a bit of picking and choosing. We tend to pick and choose what church we want to go to as Christians. But even within that, people are coming into faith and saying, well, I'll have a bit of this and a bit of that, as you say. And as they learn something new or read something new or click on something new, oh, I can add that in the mix. And sometimes managing to hold what I think we would consider a pretty eclectic mix of views and ideas together, which could be on the kind of Christian nationalism, political ideas coming together with faith, or it could be on the manifesting tarot cards all mixed in together.
And some of the challenges are because this younger generation are becoming Christians online in their bedrooms by themselves. They're then being discipled online. So there's huge discipleship challenges. So we had a young lad rock up to church who, it was his first time ever in church. And he walked straight up to the pastor after the service and was like, I've got some thoughts on how you guys do communion. And he's been a Christian for like 2 weeks, but he's listened to all this stuff about how communion should be done in church. And then we've done it differently. And he's like, this is not right. And I must say something, because he's been discipled online by somebody and then come into the local church setting and gone, well, I know what's right.
Yes, so there's a couple of things in that, is there? So our colleague Phil did some research. And so people finding faith in adulthood, 40% come to faith on their own. So that's one big trend. So they don't necessarily have a friend or a church connection. So they come to that afterwards. So their encounter is kind of directly with God, which is amazing. And they have this, but it means they don't immediately have somebody they trust to start the journey with. So they'll tend to come into maybe a church environment, and they're much more, I'm deciding if I like this because I have a personal relationship with God. I'm going to see if you meet what I'm expecting. And again, there's nobody immediately to help navigate. And then there is that consumerist part to that. reading something again this morning about, and it's so bite-sized. Two things. It can be the bite-size. That's one critique, that it just click, click, click to the next thing because we're used to that way. But also a lot, particularly of the guys that I talk to, they're used to consuming 8, 10, 15, 12 hours a week of content.
Yeah.
So the half hour on a Sunday at best, they're going, I'm churning through another 8 to 10 hours of stuff over here. And so they're going way beyond, as you said, with these questions about communion or something else, because they've read or they've listened to a whole lot of stuff, some of which is wonderful, some of which is less than wonderful.
Yeah. And so actually for churches or just, Christians who are discipling new believers, to have some good content under your belt that you've watched of, people online who you trust, that you can actually send to a new believer to say, listen to this, watch this guy, have you watched this, and then have a conversation with them about it. I think that's a great way to disciple someone, because they're consuming the content already. If you can point them in some good directions, that's a great idea. And of course, there are loads of people who are becoming Christians who aren't finding church at all.
Yeah, I
Because
suppose so.
they're just being discipled online and they're not in church. Well, they find it's so countercultural to submit yourself to a community. We are such an individualistic society that the idea of going to a church, making yourself vulnerable, committing to something weekly, giving up one of your days off, your precious days off, to go somewhere to worship with other people when that's never been something you've ever done in your life, or no one you ever know has ever done this. That's such a huge step for people, that there are lots of people who are, have definitely made a commitment to Jesus, but don't see the point of local church.
So I think if there's one takeaway, certainly for me, out of this episode, if you were like, no matter where you are, whether you're interested in Jesus, whether you've been following, it's to be connected to a local community, to a church.
Totally.
Because I totally agree with you. People who don't yet know Jesus are on the journey in, are saying, do I want to be in it? People in it are kind of like, I'm so about it, and I'll go when it suits me. And again, church has become almost an optional extra for some people, because this is why the church attendance numbers are so hard to kind of process and analyze, because actually people are definitely attending less. We know that anecdotally and statistically. And then churches aren't able to serve the community in the same way because people aren't there and volunteering. But church community is both the most challenging thing about being a Christian and the most wonderful thing, I think. Because it does bring us together with such a diverse, multi-generational, ethnically, socially diverse community. And we do have to submit to one another.
Totally. And it's one of God's greatest gifts to us as believers, like as someone who became a Christian from a non-Christian background, was exploring faith by themselves, became a Christian by themselves, enjoyed reading the Bible by themselves, consuming Christian content by themselves, but then found I went to church. It was in church I actually learned what it meant to be a Christian, because I got to watch people who were older than me living out their faith. I got to watch people that were younger than me learning about the Christian faith. I just got to watch real life happen and Christian life happen. Just being part of community has been so key to my discipleship. And yes, it can be challenging, but it is what we are meant to do as Christians. And it is such a gift to us, our discipleship and our lives. Like the local church is just such a blessing. So yeah, I would echo that. If you haven't found a local church, do find one.
Do them. Okay, so in this series, we're looking at spiritual curiosity. We are just fascinated by this. We're really excited about it. We're going to dig into a few different things without giving everything away. Like, we're going to look at some of the alternative spirituality, kind of crystals, manifesting, the rise of witch talk. This is something you've probably explored a little more, and whether gender is a factor on that. Is it a bigger deal amongst young females? Not exclusively, but maybe.
Yeah, we'll explore that in the next episode, just looking at why is this form of spirituality so intriguing? Why has it become so mainstream? Why do you hear so many celebrities talk about manifesting? Just like we hear celebrities talk about their exploration into Christianity, there are also footballers talking about how they've manifested goals and all sorts of things. Why is that happening? And what can we do to respond?
I've read some of you written about angel numbers. I was so fascinated. Some of these terms I do know about, some of them I don't. So I'm fascinated to learn on that. Then we're also going to look at Christian nationalism and the rise of kind of the right, some of the marches, the use of Christian symbols in that space. Tommy Robinson. We absolutely want to just wrestle really live with what's going on. There was 150,000 plus people at one of those marches. There was loads of Christian symbolism. Some people thought that was fantastic and some people thought it was an absolute nightmare. And many were in between and not sure what to think.
Totally. It's the complexity of our time, isn't it? And then we're going to look at some big topics as well, like AI, the rise of AI, and also for some people going completely analog, actually saying, I don't want to be on my phone. I don't want to be on social media. I'm going to get rid of all of the digital stuff and go completely analog. That's a massive trend for this year. So those are the two things together. And then we're ending looking at discipleship, aren't we, Peter?
Yeah, which seems like the perennial question, certainly in talking to church leaders a lot, like this discipleship deficit of this moment. It feels like so many people are curious, so many people are expressing interest, and yet there are so many more challenges in the world around us. This kind of, again, sense of continual chaos and people uncertain as to what the next step is. And so people are asking, have we done discipleship well enough? And the answer almost certainly is no. But look, we need to keep getting better at that. And how do we disciple people in this moment when so many are doing it live and so many are coming to faith outside of the church? So it raises lots of really challenging questions, but also really interesting questions that we love to wrestle with. And all of this in the backdrop of Ethos, which is a new part of the kind of Being Human project. Many of you, if you've been kind of following us or signed up to the emails, might know something about this. But for those who don't, maybe they're listening, maybe they haven't heard about it. What is Ethos in about a minute as we wrap up?
Ethos is a digital pathway for the spiritually curious. So this is for people who are wanting to explore the Christian faith or are just open, are curious. Are some of these people who are like, I'm just open, I'm looking into things. We've created this digital pathway to give them a way to try out the Christian faith. You take a short quiz. It tells you where your values and your behaviors align or don't align. And then you are suggested a spiritual practice to try. And these are all ancient Christian practices. So things like silence or Sabbath. You don't have to be a Christian to try these things, but we definitely frame them in the Bible and in scripture and point people towards Jesus.
Or fasting, because I know you're working on that. And somebody,
Yeah.
I was just at somewhere this morning and a lady was just saying, these two young girls come up to her and said, can we ask you a question? Like a real personal question. She's like nervously, yes. And they said, we just want to know how many times we should be fasting each week. Is it once or twice? And she's like, oh, I felt totally guilty. I was like, that's a great question. And so opening up some of these practices. And the reason we're doing that is because we found people are connecting with these practices on their way to knowing Jesus, when they know Jesus, as part of that pathway. It's a little bit like the believe, belong, behave stuff. Mm-hmm. Certainly when I was young, we talked a little bit about how those can work in different order. And similarly here, people are embracing a practice even yet when they don't yet know Jesus. And that might be a pathway to finding Jesus.
Yeah, they're just open to giving it a go and then seeing where that leads. And we want to be right in the middle of that conversation. And we really want to point people to Jesus because they might be trying all sorts of different spiritual practices, which are pointing them in all sorts of different directions. We want to make sure that there is something out there that is pointing them to Jesus.
Brilliant. We want to thank you for joining us on the Being Human podcast. We have more episodes coming. We've given you a little flavor of what is to come. You can find out more about us at the beinghumanlens.com website, but also at Ethos. So if you go to beinghumanlens.com website, you'll find Ethos, everything around Ethos there. You'll get linked out to it. That's where that spiritual pathway stuff is. That would be great. You'll find an email address there if you want to get in touch with us. Let us know. We're obviously recording a little bit before some of these go out, so it won't be an immediate response. But we'd love to hear a little bit of feedback on the show. Anything we can be doing and discussing, that would be really helpful. And if you like this, if you want to share this with friends, that would obviously be amazing and really help us to get the word out there. We just think this is such an interesting moment that we're living in around spiritual curiosity. We're excited to get to kind of serve the wider church in that moment. So if this is helpful to you, please do let friends know, like, share, review, do the usual things, and we will see you on the next episode coming soon.